She stands at the edge of the enclosure, her hands trembling against the cold metal fence. Everyone told her this was madness. The sanctuary staff pleaded with her to reconsider. Her family begged her not to go. "He's not the cub you remember," they said. "He's wild now. Dangerous. He won't recognize you." But she came anyway, driven by something deeper than reason, a bond that 7 years of separation couldn't erase. And then she sees him. Massive, powerful, a 400-pound predator moving through the tall grass with lethal grace. Their eyes meet across the distance, and for one breathless moment, the entire world holds its breath. What happens next will shatter every assumption you've ever had about the invisible threads that connect two souls, even when one of them has fangs that could end a life in seconds. This is not just a story about a woman and a lion. This is a story about the choices we make when love collides with fear, about the promises we keep even when the world tells us to forget, and about what remains when everything logical says nothing should. You're about to witness something that scientists struggle to explain, something that challenges our understanding of memory, emotion, and the bonds that transcend species. Because what happened in that enclosure on a cold October morning wasn't supposed to be possible. Think about the relationships that have shaped your life, the connections you believed were unbreakable. Now imagine being forced to walk away from one of them, told you'll never see them again, warned that returning could cost you everything. Would you have the courage to take that chance? Would you risk it all for one more moment, one more look into eyes that once knew you better than anyone? This woman did, and what she discovered will haunt you long after the story ends. If you're ready to witness one of the most emotionally devastating reunions ever captured, one that reveals truths about loyalty and memory that most people will never understand, leave a like right now. Let's make sure this story reaches those who need to see that some bonds can never be broken, no matter how much time passes or how much the world changes. And comment, "I'm ready to uncover the hidden truth." Because you're about to become part of something rare, a community that doesn't look away from the inexplicable, that doesn't dismiss what they cannot easily explain. Welcome. You've chosen to see what others fear to witness. Get ready. What comes next contains a revelation that will forever change how you see the relationship between humans and wild animals. Nothing will prepare you for what this lion remembered. Her name was Diane Winters, a wildlife conservationist who had spent 15 years working in animal rehabilitation across 3 continents. She had seen miracles and tragedies in equal measure, had held dying animals in her arms, and released recovered ones back into the wild. She thought she understood the boundaries of her profession, the necessary emotional distance required to survive in a field where heartbreak was as common as sunrise. Then came the call that changed everything. A call about a lion cub found barely alive in a shipping container at a port in Cape Town, South Africa. The cub was 3 months old, dehydrated, malnourished, and so weak he couldn't stand. He'd been stolen from a reserve, likely destined for the illegal pet trade or a canned hunting facility. When Diane first saw him, she knew his chances of survival were almost zero. His eyes were sunken, his breathing shallow, his tiny body covered in infected wounds. The veterinarian at the sanctuary where she worked gave him 48 hours at most. "Don't get attached," he warned her. "We'll make him comfortable, but that's all we can do." But Diane couldn't accept that. Something in those amber eyes, even dulled by pain and exhaustion, spoke to her in a language beyond words. She made a decision that night that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. She would take him home. For the next 6 months, Diane's apartment became a round-the-clock intensive care unit. She fed him every 2 hours with a bottle, monitored his temperature, cleaned his wounds, and slept on the floor beside him, so she could hear if his breathing changed during the night. She named him Aslan, after the great lion from the stories she'd loved as a child. And slowly, impossibly, Aslan began to fight back against death. His eyes brightened. His wounds healed. He gained weight. He began to play, batting at her hands with paws that would one day be powerful enough to bring down a buffalo. Diane documented everything. The first time he purred against her chest. The morning he took his first steady steps across her living room. The afternoon he fell asleep with his head in her lap while she read aloud to him. People warned her even then. "You're making a mistake," colleagues said. He's a wild animal. You're teaching him to trust humans, and that will get him killed." But Diane saw something different. She wasn't trying to make Aslan domestic. She was simply giving him a reason to want to live, a safe harbor while his body and spirit recovered from trauma. She knew this couldn't last forever. She knew that one day she would have to let him go. That day came sooner than either of them was ready for. At 9 months old, Aslan weighed nearly 200 pounds. He was too strong, too energetic, too inherently wild to remain in her home safely. The sanctuary found him a placement at a large reserve 300 miles away, a vast, natural habitat where he could live with other rescued lions, where he could reclaim the wildness that was his birthright. Diane knew it was right. She knew it was necessary. But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. The morning they took him away, Aslan seemed to sense something was wrong. He followed Diane around her apartment, making soft chuffing sounds, pressing his massive head against her legs. When the transport team arrived, she walked him to the vehicle herself, her hand resting on his mane the entire way. At the door of the crate, he turned and looked at her with those amber eyes, now bright and healthy and full of life she had fought so hard to preserve. She whispered something to him, words only they would ever know, and then he stepped inside. The door closed, and he was gone. For the first year, Diane received regular updates from the reserve. Aslan was adapting well. He'd been introduced to a coalition of other young male lions and had integrated successfully. He was hunting, playing, thriving in ways he never could have in her small apartment. The reports should have brought her comfort. Instead, they felt like letters from a world she was no longer allowed to inhabit. She'd look at the attached photos, Aslan sprawled in the sun, Aslan at a kill, Aslan growing into the magnificent predator he was always meant to become, and feel a hollowness that no amount of logic could fill. She threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried her friends. She took on more cases, more impossible rescues, working 18-hour days until exhaustion was the only thing that let her sleep. She told herself she was saving lives, making a difference, honoring the purpose that had brought her to this field in the first place. But late at night, alone in an apartment that still carried the ghost of Aslan's presence, she knew the truth. She was running from the grief of a goodbye she'd never fully accepted. The updates from the reserve became less frequent, every 6 months, then annually. Then they stopped altogether. Diane told herself this was natural, even healthy. Aslan had moved on. He was living the life he was meant to live, surrounded by his own kind, hunting across vast territories, existing in the wild rhythms that were his inheritance. He didn't need her anymore. He probably didn't remember her at all. Lions weren't like dogs or elephants, animals famous for their long memories and emotional attachments. Lions were practical, instinct-driven, focused on survival and territory and the hierarchy of the pride. At least, that's what she told herself. That's what the research said. That's what every expert she'd ever worked with had assured her. Animals lived in the present. They didn't dwell on the past. They didn't harbor emotions like nostalgia or longing. The 6 months Aslan had spent in her care were a blink in his lifespan, an insignificant footnote that would fade entirely as his brain matured and his true nature asserted itself. To believe anything else was anthropomorphization, the cardinal sin of wildlife professionals. It was projecting human emotions onto creatures who experienced the world in fundamentally different ways. But Diane couldn't shake the feeling, irrational, unscientific, impossible as it was, that somewhere in that vast reserve, Aslan carried some memory of her. Not a conscious memory, perhaps. Not something he could articulate or even fully understand. But something deeper, something cellular. A recognition that lived in his bones, in the rhythm of his heartbeat, in the neural pathways formed during those early months when her voice was the first thing he heard after waking and the last thing before sleep. 7 years passed. Diane moved to a different city, took a position at a larger sanctuary, continued the work that defined her. She dated occasionally, though nothing serious ever developed. She adopted a dog, a rescue, naturally, and told herself she was content. She had a good life, a meaningful career, friends who cared about her. She had made peace with the fact that Aslan was a chapter that had closed, A beautiful and painful experience that had taught her about the limits of connection, the boundaries that must exist between humans and wild animals. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, her phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to James Kerrigan, the director of the reserve where Aslan lived. His tone was cautious, almost apologetic. "I'm calling about Aslan," he said. "I know it's been years, but we have a situation, and I thought you should know." Diane's heart stopped. A situation could mean only one thing in their world: injury, illness, or death. She braced herself for the words she'd been dreading since the day she'd said goodbye. But that's not what James said. Instead, he told her something that made no sense, something that contradicted everything she thought she knew. "He's dying, Diane. We've done everything we can, but it's a neurological condition, and it's progressing fast. The veterinarians give him maybe 2 weeks, maybe less. He's not in pain yet, but he will be soon." Diane felt the room tilt. She managed to ask the question that mattered. "Why are you telling me this?" There was a long pause. Then James said the words that would pull her back into Aslan's orbit, back into the impossible space where logic and emotion collided. "Because he should have died 3 months ago, and we think he's waiting for something." James explained it to her in the careful, measured tone of someone who didn't quite believe his own words. 3 months earlier, Aslan had begun showing symptoms: loss of coordination, difficulty walking, episodes where he would stand motionless for hours as if lost in some internal fog. The veterinary team ran every test imaginable. Scans revealed a degenerative neurological condition, likely genetic, that was slowly shutting down his motor functions and would eventually reach his brain stem. There was no treatment, no cure. The most humane option was euthanasia before the suffering became unbearable. They'd scheduled it twice. Both times, something had stopped them. Not doubt about the diagnosis, that was certain. Not hope for recovery, that was impossible. But something in Aslan's behavior, something in the way he carried himself, suggested he wasn't ready. "He keeps going to the fence," James said. "The one that faces the access road where vehicles come in. Every morning, he walks there and waits. He'll stay for hours, just watching. And when no one comes, he goes back to his resting place. But the next morning, he does it again." The behavior had baffled the entire staff. Lions were territorial, but this wasn't territorial behavior. It was expectant, anticipatory, as if Aslan was waiting for someone specific, someone he believed would come. "We started going through his files," James continued, "looking at his history, trying to understand if there was some pattern we were missing. That's when we found your records from his first year. The photos, the notes about his rehabilitation. Diane, the fence he goes to. It's the same type of fencing that was around your property when you had him. Chain link with metal poles. We replaced most of it years ago, but that section remains because it's structurally sound." Diane felt something crack open inside her chest. "You think he's waiting for me?" The question sounded absurd even as she asked it. 7 years. Nearly 3,000 days. Lions didn't have that kind of memory, especially not for a period that represented less than 4% of his life. James was quiet for a moment. "I think something in him remembers safety, remembers care, remembers a time before he was strong enough to survive on his own. And I think, if we're being honest with ourselves, we've both seen enough in this field to know that animals surprise us constantly, that they carry memories and emotions we don't fully understand." He wasn't asking her to come, not explicitly, but the invitation hung in the air between them like smoke. "If you wanted to see him," James said carefully, "before we have to make the final decision, I could arrange it. No pressure, no expectations, but I thought you should have the option." Diane's first instinct was to refuse. It had taken her years to build the walls that protected her from this kind of pain. 7 years of distance, of forcing herself to accept that Aslan had moved on, that their connection was a one-way street built on her need to nurture and his need to survive. If she went back now, if she opened that door, she'd be destroyed all over again. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent. What if James was right? What if Aslan was waiting? What if, in some way she couldn't explain or defend scientifically, he'd held onto something from those 6 months, some imprint of her voice, her scent, the feeling of safety she'd represented. And what if he was spending his final days searching for that one thing, that one person, and she was too afraid of her own pain to give him that peace? She told James she needed time to think. She hung up and sat in her empty apartment, staring at the wall where Aslan's photo still hung, an image from his 4th month with her, when he was healthy enough to play, but still small enough to curl up on her couch. In the photo, he was looking directly at the camera, and even captured in that frozen moment, his eyes held an intelligence, an awareness, that transcended species boundaries. Diane thought about all the animals she'd released over the years, the philosophy she'd built her career on: save them, heal them, give them back to the wild, and let them go completely. Don't look back. Don't wonder. Don't allow attachment to compromise the clarity needed to do this work effectively. It was the right approach, the sustainable approach, the only way to keep doing this without being swallowed by grief. But it was also, she realized, a lie she'd told herself to make the losses bearable. Because she did look back. She did wonder. Every single one of them left a mark, a small ghost that lived in her memory. And Aslan wasn't just another case. He was the one who had changed her, who had shown her the depths of resilience possible when a creature decides it wants to live. He'd fought so hard in those early months, and she'd fought alongside him. They'd made promises to each other, unspoken, maybe, but no less real. Diane booked a flight for the next morning. She didn't tell her colleagues where she was going or why. She didn't overthink it, because overthinking would lead to talking herself out of it. And she'd spent 7 years doing that already. She packed a small bag, called her neighbor to watch her dog, and drove to the airport while dawn was still just a promise on the horizon. During the 3-hour flight, she tried to prepare herself for what she might find. Aslan wouldn't be the cub she remembered. He'd be a fully grown male lion in decline, his body betraying him, his strength fading. He might not know her. He might be too far gone in his illness to respond to anything. Worse, she might discover that James was wrong, that Aslan's fence-watching was just random behavior, neurological misfiring from a dying brain, and that she'd projected meaning onto meaningless action because she needed to believe their bond had mattered. That fear haunted her most. Not that Aslan had forgotten her, but that there had never been anything to forget. That what she'd experienced as profound connection was simply a frightened animal accepting care from the nearest source, no different than if anyone else had been there. James met her at the reserve entrance. He looked older than she remembered, his hair gone gray, new lines etched around his eyes. The reserve had expanded since her last visit. More acreage, better facilities, a larger staff. They'd been doing good work here. She could see that immediately. The animals were healthy, the enclosure spacious and enriched, the whole operation run with the kind of professional competence that comes from people who genuinely care. He's in the recovery section, James said as they walked. We moved him there 2 weeks ago to monitor him more closely. It's quieter, less stressful for him. Diane noticed he didn't say, make him more comfortable, even though that's what recovery sections usually meant at the end. James was still holding on to hope, or at least the performance of it. They passed enclosures housing leopards, caracals, cheetahs, all rescues, all with stories of trauma and survival. At another time, Diane would have wanted to hear each one. But now, every step closer to Aslan's enclosure felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff, knowing she was going to jump but unsure if she'd fly or fall. I should prepare you, James said, stopping before they turned the final corner. He's lost probably 60 pounds. He's weak. He sleeps most of the day. And the neurological symptoms mean he's unsteady on his feet. He's not the Aslan you'll remember physically. Diane nodded, bracing herself. But James wasn't finished. I also need you to understand the risk. He's still a lion, still a predator. The illness hasn't changed his instincts. If he perceives you as a threat, or if he doesn't recognize you, or if something triggers his defensive response, this could be dangerous. We'll be watching the entire time, and we can intervene if necessary, but there are no guarantees. She understood. She'd worked with enough wildlife to know that even the most socialized animals could be unpredictable, especially when sick or in pain. What do you need me to do? She asked. James explained the protocol. She would approach the fence slowly, speaking normally, making no sudden movements. If Aslan showed signs of aggression, ears back, tail lashing, vocalizations, she would back away immediately. Under no circumstances would she attempt to enter the enclosure. "We're not trying to recreate your time together," James emphasized. "We're just giving him the opportunity to see you, hear you, catch your scent. That's all. If there's recognition, it'll happen at the fence." They turned the corner, and there it was, a large enclosure with natural vegetation, a water feature, shaded areas, and multiple platforms at different heights. The far end was fenced with that old chain link, the same style that had once enclosed Diane's yard. And there, lying in the shade of a thorn tree, was Aslan. Even from a distance, even diminished by illness, he was breathtaking. His mane, though not as full as it should be, still framed his face like dark gold fire. His body, though thinner than healthy, still carried the fundamental architecture of a predator built for power. He was sleeping, his sides rising and falling with breath that seemed labored even at rest. Diane felt tears start before she could stop them. This magnificent creature, who had fought so hard to live, was losing another battle, and she was here to witness it, to say goodbye properly this time, or maybe just to ease her own guilt about the 7 years she'd stayed away. James touched her arm gently. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Diane took a breath, steadying herself. She thought about the Aslan she'd known, the cub who would cry until she picked him up, who learned to trust again despite every reason not to, who purred so loudly when content that she could feel the vibration through her entire body. She thought about the promises they'd made to each other in that small apartment, when the world had narrowed to just the two of them against death itself. And then she started walking toward the fence. Each step felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light at the same time. Diane kept her pace slow, her breathing measured, her eyes on Aslan's sleeping form. Behind her, she could hear James and 2 other staff members following at a respectful distance, their presence a safety net she hoped they wouldn't need. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the cool air, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of the reserve waking up, birds calling, other animals stirring, the eternal rhythms of life continuing regardless of individual dramas. When she was about 20 feet from the fence, Aslan's ear twitched. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Diane had spent enough months watching every detail of his body language to recognize it immediately. He was waking up. She stopped, giving him space to orient himself, to assess his surroundings in his own time. The ear twitched again, and then his eyes opened, those amber eyes that had looked at her from the edge of death all those years ago and decided to stay. He lifted his head slowly, the movement clearly requiring effort. His gaze swept the enclosure, unfocused at first, and then landed on the fence. On her. For several seconds, he just stared, and Diane's heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she thought it might shatter. This was the moment. Either he would see a stranger, a human like any other, and go back to sleep, or he would see something else, something more. Aslan's nostrils flared. He was scenting the air, trying to place her in the catalog of smells that lions use to navigate their world. Diane stood perfectly still, barely breathing, every nerve in her body screaming with tension. Behind her, James murmured something to his colleagues, but she couldn't make out the words. All her focus was on Aslan, on the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to bring her into clearer focus. And then something changed. It was nothing she could name precisely, no single gesture or expression, but rather a total shift in his energy. His body, which had been relaxed in the way of sick animals conserving strength, suddenly tensed. His ears came forward, fully alert. His eyes widened, and in them, Diane saw something that made her breath catch, recognition. Not the vague acknowledgement of a familiar shape or sound, but specific, undeniable recognition. He knew her. Aslan tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him. The neurological condition that was claiming him made the movement uncoordinated, and he stumbled, nearly falling. Diane's instinct was to rush forward, to help him, but she forced herself to stay rooted. He tried again, more carefully this time, and managed to get his front legs under him. His back legs followed, shakier but functional. And then, moving with a determination that seemed to override his body's limitations, Aslan began walking toward the fence. It wasn't the smooth, powerful gait of a healthy lion. It was halting, unsteady, each step requiring visible concentration. But he didn't stop. He didn't look away from Diane. His entire focus was on reaching the fence, on closing the distance between them. Behind her, Diane heard James say, "My God," in a voice barely above a whisper. The other staff members were silent, and she realized they were all witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied their training and their assumptions about how these animals experienced the world. When Aslan was 10 feet from the fence, he made a sound. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a chuff, the same vocalization he'd made as a cub, the sound lions used to greet each other in friendship and recognition. Diane felt tears streaming down her face, unchecked and unashamed. She'd heard that sound in her dreams for 7 years, always waking before she could respond. Now it was real, echoing across the space between them like a question she finally had the chance to answer. "Hi, Aslan," she said, her voice breaking. "Hi, baby. I'm here. I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm here." At the sound of her voice, Aslan's pace quickened. He reached the fence and pressed his face against it, his enormous head pushing through the chain link as far as the openings would allow. His eyes never left hers, and in them, she saw everything she needed to see. He hadn't forgotten. Whatever neural pathways carried memory, whatever part of him stored emotional imprints, had held onto her across 7 years and countless experiences. She was still there, still recognizable, still significant. Diane approached the fence slowly, knowing this was the moment of greatest risk. Even though Aslan showed no signs of aggression, even though every signal he was giving screamed recognition and welcome, he was still a wild animal, still unpredictable. But her fear was buried beneath something stronger, the overwhelming need to touch him again, to close the circle they'd opened all those years ago in her apartment when a dying cub had decided to trust her. She reached out her hand, letting it hover just beyond the fence. Aslan pressed forward, his wet nose making contact with her fingertips through the chain link. And then he did something that made James gasp audibly behind her. He started to purr. The purr was deep and resonant, vibrating through Aslan's entire body with an intensity that Diane could feel even through the fence. It was the same sound he'd made as a cub curled in her lap, the rumble that had lulled her to sleep on nights when she'd kept vigil beside him. But now, magnified by his adult size and power, it was like standing next to an engine, a physical presence in the air that spoke of contentment and recognition and relief. He was telling her, in the only language they'd ever truly shared, that he remembered, that she mattered, that despite everything, time, distance, the wild life he'd lived without her, some part of him had been waiting for this moment. Diane pressed her palm flat against the fence, and Aslan pushed his face harder against the chain link, trying to reach her more fully. His whiskers bent against the metal, and she could see the frustration in his eyes. The fence that separated them, meant to protect her from him, was now the barrier preventing the reunion they both needed. Behind her, James said, "Diane, we should probably—" But she cut him off without turning around. "James, I need to go in." The words came out calm, factual, as if she'd asked for something completely reasonable instead of something that violated every protocol of wildlife safety. "Absolutely not," James said immediately, his voice sharp with alarm. "He's a lion, Diane. A sick, unpredictable lion. What you're seeing might be recognition, but it might also be confusion or neurological symptoms, or—" "It's not confusion," Diane said, still not looking away from Aslan. "You know it's not. You've seen enough animals in your career to know what confusion looks like. This is recognition. This is memory. This is real." She heard James move closer, heard the concern in his voice when he spoke again. "Even if that's true, even if he knows you, he's still operating on instinct. He's in pain. He's weak, and pain can make any animal dangerous. I can't let you risk it." Diane understood his position. She understood all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. If she went into that enclosure and something went wrong, if Aslan's illness caused him to lash out, if some trigger she couldn't anticipate activated his predator response, if the years had changed him more than she believed, it would be catastrophic. Not just for her, but for James, for the reserve, for everyone who'd worked so hard to give these animals a second chance. But she also understood something else, something that went deeper than protocols and liability and rational risk assessment. Aslan was dying. In a few days, maybe a week, he would reach the point where continuing meant suffering, and they would make the humane choice to end his life. This was his last window and hers. If there was any chance to honor what they'd been to each other, to acknowledge the bond that had saved his life once and had haunted hers ever since, it had to be now. Through the fence wasn't enough. Not for this. Not for goodbye. He's waiting for me, Diane said quietly. Can't you see it? He's been waiting at this fence every morning for 3 months, and now I'm here, and he's asking me to come closer. He's asking me to trust him the way he trusted me when he was dying, and I was all he had. She finally turned to look at James, and she saw in his face the internal battle of someone who knew she was right, but also knew what policy demanded. I can't authorize this, he said. If something happens, then it's on me. Diane interrupted. I'll sign anything you want. A waiver, a release, whatever. But James, he's been waiting, and I owe him this. There was a long silence, broken only by Aslan's purring and the distant sounds of the reserve. Finally, James exhaled slowly and looked at his colleagues. Get the gate key, he said to one of them. The young woman looked shocked. Director, are you? Get the key, James repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. And get the tranquilizer rifle ready. If he shows any sign of aggression, we intervene immediately. Understood. The staff scattered to follow his orders, and James turned back to Diane. 5 minutes, he said. That's all I can give you. 5 minutes, and if anything feels wrong, you get out. No hesitation. No second chances. Diane nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation, so intense it made her dizzy. This was either the most right or most wrong decision she'd ever made, and she wouldn't know which until it was over. One of the staff members returned with the key and unlocked the personnel gate on the side of the enclosure. The metal hinges creaked as the gate swung open, and suddenly there was nothing between Diane and Aslan except 20 feet of African grass and the enormous weight of 7 years apart. Aslan was still at the main fence, still watching her, but when the gate opened, his attention shifted immediately. He saw the opening, saw Diane standing in the frame of it, and understood what was happening. He took a step toward her, then another, his movements still uncoordinated, but driven by determination that transcended his physical limitations. Diane stepped into the enclosure, and behind her, she heard the gate close, but not lock. Exit available if needed. Escape possible if it all went wrong. But as she moved forward and Aslan moved toward her, as the distance between them shrank from 20 feet to 15 to 10, Diane knew with a certainty that lived in her bones that nothing was going to go wrong. This was what she'd come for. This was what Aslan had been waiting for. This was the promise they'd made to each other being fulfilled at last. At 5 feet apart, Diane dropped to her knees in the grass, making herself smaller, less threatening, more approachable. And Aslan, this massive predator who weighed nearly 400 pounds even in his diminished state, this creature built to kill, lowered his head and pressed it against her chest. The purring intensified, so powerful now that Diane felt it resonating through her entire body, syncing with her heartbeat until she couldn't tell where her rhythm ended and his began. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the warmth of his fur, the solid reality of him, the impossible fact that he was here and real and remembered. 7 years collapsed into nothing. They were back in her apartment, back in those early months when survival was uncertain and all they had was each other and the desperate hope that morning would come. I'm so sorry, Diane whispered into his mane. I'm so sorry I stayed away. I'm so sorry. Aslan pushed harder against her, and then he did something that shattered her completely. He made the same small crying sound he'd made as a cub when he wanted to be picked up, when he was scared or lonely or needed reassurance that he wasn't alone. It was a sound she'd heard 1,000 times in those 6 months, a sound she'd never expected to hear again. And here it was, coming from this enormous lion, this magnificent creature who was supposed to have forgotten her, who should have moved on and become purely wild and untouchable. But he hadn't forgotten. He hadn't moved on. He'd carried her with him somehow, through all those years and all those miles, through his growth and his strength and finally his decline. And now, in his last days, he'd called her back. Or maybe she'd answered a call that had been there all along, just waiting for her to be brave enough to listen. Time seemed to suspend itself in that enclosure. Diane lost all sense of the 5 minutes James had granted, lost all awareness of the staff watching from outside, lost everything except the weight of Aslan's head against her and the steady rhythm of his purring. She ran her hands along his mane, feeling the texture of it, so different from the soft cub, first she remembered, but still unmistakably him. His eyes were half closed in contentment, and occasionally he would lift his head to look directly at her face, as if confirming she was really there, really solid, not some fevered dream conjured by his failing brain. When she looked into those amber eyes now, Diane saw the full arc of his life reflected back. She saw the dying cub in the shipping container, the fighter who'd refused to give up, the adolescent who'd grown strong enough to leave her, and now this adult facing his own mortality with a grace that humbled her. But she also saw something else, a question, not formed in words, because they'd never needed words, but clear nonetheless. Where were you? Why did you leave? Did you forget me the way everyone said I would forget you? I never forgot you, Diane said aloud, knowing he couldn't understand the words, but hoping he'd understand the tone, the emotion behind them. Not for a single day. I thought I was supposed to let you go completely. I thought that's what love meant, releasing you so fully that I became nothing in your story, just a brief chapter you'd move past. But that was wrong. That was me being afraid of this exact feeling, this exact pain, because I knew that if I let myself believe our bond mattered, losing you would destroy me. Aslan made a low rumbling sound, different from the purr, but equally communicative. He shifted his weight and, with visible effort, maneuvered himself, so he was lying down with his head in her lap, exactly the way he'd done as a cub. The position must have required significant coordination given his neurological symptoms, but he managed it, and once settled, he released a long exhale that sounded like relief, like something he'd been holding for years, finally being released. Diane looked up and saw James at the fence, his eyes wide, his professional composure completely abandoned. Next to him, the other staff members were filming on their phones, capturing this moment that would seem impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. She knew what they were seeing, a full-grown male lion, an apex predator, behaving like a house cat with the only person who'd ever made him feel completely safe. It contradicted everything they'd been taught about wild animals and appropriate boundaries and the dangers of anthropomorphization. But it was happening anyway. Because relationships don't always follow the rules we create for them. Because love, and yes, Diane allowed herself to use that word now, without shame or qualification, doesn't respect species boundaries when it's genuine. Because some bonds, once formed in fire and fear and the desperate choice to survive together, leave marks that time can't erase. Tell me about these years, Diane said softly, stroking the bridge of Aslan's nose the way he'd always loved. Tell me what it was like. Did you hunt well? Did you make friends? Were there lionesses who caught your eye? Aslan's eyes opened fully at the sound of her voice, and she could swear she saw recognition not just of her, but of this specific ritual. She talked to him constantly during his recovery, narrating her day, reading books aloud, asking him questions she'd answer herself. It had been as much for her comfort as his, a way to maintain human connection during those isolated months. But it had become their language, the soundtrack to their relationship. She told him about her 7 years too, the other animals she'd saved, though none had touched her the way he had. The attempts at relationships that had failed because no one could understand why she kept a photo of a lion on her wall and sometimes woke up crying from dreams she couldn't explain. The way she'd built her life around never being that vulnerable again, never investing that deeply, never allowing another creature to matter so much that losing them would leave a hole nothing else could fill. But I was wrong, she whispered, because the hole was already there. It's been there since the day they took you away. I just pretended it wasn't, and that pretending cost me 7 years of knowing you, of seeing who you became, of being part of your story beyond those first months. I thought I was protecting myself from pain, but all I did was guarantee a different kind of pain. The pain of absence, of wondering, of questions that would never have answers. Aslan made a soft chuffing sound, and Diane felt his rough tongue rasp gently against her hand. It was a grooming gesture, something lions do to family, to pride members they care about. He was claiming her again, reasserting their connection, telling her in his language that the 7 years didn't matter, that she was still his, and he was still hers, that some things transcend time and distance and logic. From the fence, James called out, "Diane, it's been 15 minutes. We should." But he trailed off, because even as he said it, he must have realized how absurd it was to talk about should when they were all witnessing shouldn't be possible. "A few more minutes," Diane called back, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. She wasn't done yet. They weren't done yet. There were still things that needed to be said, felt, understood between them. She thought about all the advice she'd given to other rehabilitators over the years, all the stern lectures about emotional distance and professional boundaries and the importance of preparing animals for a life that wouldn't include their human caregivers. She believed it all, had preached it as gospel, and maybe it was the right advice for most cases, for normal situations where attachment could be managed and controlled and channeled into healthy release. But this wasn't most cases. This had never been normal. From the moment she'd seen Aslan barely alive in that shipping container, from the first time he'd looked at her with those dying eyes, and something in both of them had recognized the other. They'd been writing a different story, one that didn't fit the templates or follow the rules, one that demanded its own truth. Aslan shifted again, and this time when he looked up at her, Diane saw something that broke her in a completely new way: gratitude. Not the simple appreciation of an animal receiving food or comfort, but the complex gratitude of a being who understands they've been given something precious, something that changed the trajectory of their entire existence. He was thanking her for those first months, for fighting for his life when it would have been easier to let him go, and for this moment, for coming back when she could have stayed away, for proving that their bond hadn't been one-sided or imaginary or something she'd invented to make herself feel heroic. "You're welcome," Diane said through tears, "and thank you for waiting. Thank you for holding on. Thank you for reminding me that some things matter more than safety, more than protocol, more than the walls we build to protect ourselves from feeling too much." As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the enclosure, Diane became aware that this moment couldn't last forever. Aslan was tiring. She could feel it in the way his body grew heavier against her, in the way his purring began to fade into slower, deeper breaths that spoke of exhaustion. The effort of walking to the fence, of holding himself up for their reunion, had taxed him severely. His illness was a clock running down, and every minute with her brought him closer to the moment when standing, moving, even being conscious, would become impossible. James approached the fence again, his voice gentle but firm. "Diane, he needs to rest. And we need to talk about next steps." She knew what next steps meant. It meant the decision they'd been postponing for 3 months, the humane choice that everyone involved had been avoiding because it felt like murder even when it was mercy. Aslan was dying. That was unchangeable. The only question was whether he would be allowed to decline until the pain became unbearable, or whether they would make the kind decision to end it before suffering truly began. "How long?" Diane asked, still stroking Aslan's mane, unwilling to look away from him even for a moment. "Days," James replied. "A week at most. The neurological progression is accelerating. Within 48 hours, he'll start losing control of his bowels and bladder. Within 4 or 5 days, he won't be able to stand. And after that..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all knew what came after that: seizures, paralysis, a slow suffocation as his brain stem failed. No animal deserved that end, least of all one who'd fought so hard to live. "What if I stayed?" Diane heard herself say. The words came out before she'd fully formed the thought, but once spoken, they felt inevitable. "What if I stayed with him, for however long he has left? Not in the enclosure full time," she added, seeing James's expression, "but here at the reserve, so I could sit with him, so he wouldn't be alone." James was quiet for a long moment. "It would be unprecedented," he finally said. "We've never had anyone..." "I know," Diane interrupted. I know it breaks protocol. I know it complicates things. But James, look at him. They both looked at Aslan, who had opened his eyes at the sound of their voices. Even exhausted, even dying, there was an alertness in his gaze when he looked at Diane that hadn't been there for months. James had told her that Aslan had been listless, unresponsive, going through the motions of existence without any apparent interest in it. But now, with Diane present, he was engaged. Present, as if her arrival had given him a reason to fight, for whatever time remained. "He's been waiting for me," Diane said softly. 3 months of going to that fence every morning, looking for something, for someone. You said it yourself. And now I'm here, and he's found what he was looking for. If I leave now, if I go back to my life and leave him to die alone, I'll never forgive myself. And I think," her voice broke, "I think he'll know. I think he'll understand that I chose to leave him again, at the end, when he needed me most." James rubbed his face tiredly. "The board will have questions. There are liability issues, insurance concerns. Then let me sign whatever you need," Diane said. "Every waiver, every release, every acknowledgement of risk. I'll take full responsibility for anything that happens. But please, James, let me do this for him. Let me give him this one last gift." Another long silence, and then James nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. We have a staff cabin that's empty. You can stay there. We'll set up a schedule so you can spend time with him throughout the day. But Diane," his voice became stern, "you can't sleep in the enclosure. You can't be in there unsupervised after dark. I'm already bending every rule we have. I can't compromise safety that far." "I understand," Diane said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you. Thank you for—" "Don't thank me yet." James cut her off. "This is going to be hard. Harder than anything you've ever done. You're going to watch him decline. Watch him lose himself piece by piece. And then, when it becomes too much, you're going to have to be there when we end it. That's the price of staying. If you're going to be with him for this, you have to be with him for all of it." Diane looked down at Aslan, who had closed his eyes again, his breathing deep and even against her lap. She thought about what James was asking, not just to witness Aslan's death, but to participate in it, to hold him while the veterinarian administered the injection that would stop his heart. It was the opposite of everything she'd done for him at the beginning, when every ounce of her energy had gone into keeping him alive. This time, her final act of love would be letting him go. "I'll be there," she said. "I promise." For the next hour, Diane sat with Aslan in the enclosure while he slept. She committed every detail to memory: the pattern of his breathing, the warmth of his body, the particular color of his mane where the sun hit it. She memorized the weight of him, the way his whiskers twitched occasionally in sleep, the small sounds he made. These would be her last new memories of him alive, and she wanted them etched so deeply in her mind that nothing could ever erase them. Eventually, James returned with another staff member. "We need to let him rest properly," he said gently. "And you need to eat something. Get settled in the cabin. You can come back this afternoon." Diane nodded and carefully extracted herself from beneath Aslan's head, lowering it gently to the grass. He woke partially, his eyes opening just enough to register her movement. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, feeling his breath warm against her face. "I'm not leaving," she whispered. "I'm staying. I'll be back soon, I promise. You rest now." As if he understood, Aslan released a long exhale and closed his eyes again. Diane stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long in one position, and walked toward the gate. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she might not be able to leave, even for a few hours. James locked the gate behind her, and they walked in silence back toward the main facilities. The other staff members they passed stared at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. Word had clearly spread about what had happened in the enclosure, about the woman and the lion who remembered each other across 7 years. At the cabin, James handed her a key and a schedule. "Morning sessions are 9 to 11, he said. "Afternoon is 2 to 4. Evening is 6 to 7:30, no later. Someone will come get you when it's time." Diane took the paper, studying the neat blocks of time that represented her remaining days with Aslan. Hours that felt simultaneously too short and too long, compressed and eternal. "James," she said, "what you're doing, what you're allowing, I'm not doing it for you." James interrupted. "I'm doing it for him. Because in 30 years of working with wildlife, I've never seen anything like what I saw in that enclosure today. And if there's even a chance that your presence gives him peace at the end, then it's worth every policy I'm breaking." The next 5 days existed outside normal time, in a space where past and present collapsed into each other. Diane fell into a rhythm dictated entirely by Aslan's needs, arriving at the enclosure each morning to find him already waiting by the fence, spending her allotted hours sitting with him, talking to him, simply being present while his body continued its steady betrayal. Each day, she could see the decline. His movements became more labored. His appetite disappeared entirely. The tremors that had been occasional became constant, and there were moments when his eyes would go distant and unfocused, as if he was already halfway to somewhere else. But when she was there, when she spoke to him and touched him and reminded him he wasn't alone, something in him would sharpen. He would press against her the way he had that first day, would purr despite the obvious effort it cost him, would track her movements with his eyes when his body was too weak to follow. The veterinary staff, checking him twice daily now, marveled at his resilience. He should have shut down completely by now. One of them told Diane, "The disease progression indicates he should be comatose, but something is keeping him present, keeping him engaged." That something was her. Diane knew it with a certainty that transcended science. Aslan was holding on because she was there, because after 3 months of waiting at that fence, she'd finally come back, and he wasn't ready to let her go again. It was beautiful and devastating in equal measure. Beautiful because it confirmed that their bond was real and mutual and powerful enough to give him a reason to fight. Devastating because she understood that her presence might actually be prolonging his suffering, trapping him in a failing body because he couldn't bear to leave while she was still there. On the 4th day, Aslan stopped being able to stand without assistance. The staff had to help him to his feet, and even then, he could only walk a few steps before collapsing. Diane spent that entire session sitting on the ground beside him, her hand resting on his side, so she could feel each breath. His purring had faded to a barely audible rumble, but it was still there, still present, his way of telling her he knew she was with him. "I think it's time," James said quietly when Diane's evening session ended. She'd known this was coming, had been bracing for it since the moment she arrived, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "Tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Tomorrow morning, before it gets worse, while he still has some quality of life left." Quality of life. Such a strange phrase to apply to a lion who could no longer stand, who hadn't eaten in days, whose eyes reflected a pain that went beyond physical. Diane went back to her cabin and didn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways a life could be measured. Aslan had lived 7.5 years, not long for a lion, especially one who should have had another decade ahead of him. But what a 7.5 years it had been. From near death to full strength, from captivity to freedom, from solitude to belonging. He'd hunted under African stars. He'd felt the sun on his back and the wind in his mane. He'd lived wild and free, had experienced the life his species was meant to live. And at the beginning and end of it all, there had been love. That had to count for something. That had to mean his life, however shortened, had been worth living. When dawn came, pale and cold, Diane walked to the enclosure one last time. Aslan was lying on his side, his breathing shallow and rapid. When he saw her, his tail moved slightly, not the vigorous wagging of a happy animal, but the small acknowledgement of someone who had just enough energy left to say, "I see you. I know you're here." Diane entered the enclosure without waiting for staff clearance. They were beyond protocols now, beyond rules. James and the veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chun, were already there, along with 2 other staff members who would help manage the process. Diane knelt beside Aslan and gently lifted his massive head into her lap. His eyes opened, and even clouded with pain and exhaustion, they were still the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here. I'm right here. Dr. Chun approached with a syringe, her expression somber. She'd explained the process to Diane the night before, a sedative first, to ensure Aslan felt nothing, followed by the final injection that would stop his heart. It would be peaceful. Quick. The most merciful ending they could give him. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Chun said gently. Diane wanted to say she'd never be ready, that no amount of time would make this okay, that every cell in her body was screaming to find another way, to fight harder, to refuse to accept that this was how their story ended. But she also knew that was selfishness speaking. Aslan was suffering. Keeping him alive another day, another hour, would be for her benefit, not his. The most loving thing she could do was let him go. Okay, she whispered. Dr. Chun administered the sedative, and within seconds, Diane felt Aslan's body relax, the tension draining out of him as the drugs took effect. His breathing slowed, deepened, became the rhythm of sleep rather than pain. His eyes closed, and for a moment, he looked the way he had as a cub, peaceful, safe, completely at ease. Diane leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, just as she had that first day in the enclosure. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for fighting when you could have given up. Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for teaching me that some bonds don't break just because we walk away from them. She felt his last breath against her face, a soft exhale that seemed to carry with it everything they'd been to each other. And then stillness, complete and total and irreversible. Dr. Chun checked his pulse, waited a full minute, and then nodded to confirm what they all already knew. Aslan was gone. The enclosure, which had been filled with his presence just moments before, now felt hollow, like a photograph of a place that used to matter. Diane sat there holding his head, feeling the warmth slowly leave his body, and finally allowed herself to break completely. She wept the way she hadn't let herself weep for 7 years. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs, that were made of grief and relief and love and regret all tangled together in a knot that would probably never fully untangle. James and Dr. Chun stood at a respectful distance, giving her space to say her private goodbye. The sun rose higher, painting the enclosure in gold light, and Diane thought about how inadequate all their words were. Reunion, connection, bond, love. None of them captured what she and Aslan had been to each other. None of them explained how a dying cub and a scared woman had found each other in the darkness and had chosen, against all logic, to mean something to each other. Eventually, Diane had to leave the enclosure, had to stand, had to let the staff take Aslan's body to be handled with dignity and respect, had to walk away from that space where everything impossible had become real. James walked her back to the cabin so she could gather her things, and they stood outside in the morning light, both of them exhausted and emotionally wrung out. I've worked in wildlife conservation for 3 decades, James said finally. I've seen incredible things, migrations, births, releases, successful rehabilitations. But what I saw between you and Aslan these past days, that's something different. That's something I still can't fully explain. Diane nodded, unable to speak yet. The story will spread, James continued. We have footage, photographs, documentation of everything that happened. The scientific community will be interested. There will be studies, papers, attempts to explain it in neurological or behavioral terms. He paused, looking at her directly. But we both know that whatever explanation they come up with will miss the truth. Because the truth isn't in his brain chemistry or his memory centers or any of the physical mechanisms they'll want to measure. The truth is that he loved you, and you loved him, and that love was strong enough to survive 7 years of separation and manifest in his final days as the thing he needed most. After James left her alone, Diane sat in the cabin and thought about what comes after. She would go home to her life, back to her work saving other animals, back to the routines that had defined her before this week exploded everything she thought she understood. But she wouldn't be the same person. She couldn't be. Because Aslan had given her something in their reunion, something even more valuable than the closure she'd come seeking. He'd proven to her that the walls she'd built after he left, the emotional distance she'd maintained to protect herself from being hurt again, weren't strength. They were fear disguised as wisdom. Real strength, she understood now, was allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to form these bonds in the first place. It was choosing to love even when you knew loss was inevitable, even when you knew the ending would break you, because the alternative, living without that connection, that depth of feeling, wasn't really living at all. Aslan had taught her that when he was a cub fighting for survival, and he'd reminded her in his final days by fighting to stay present just long enough to see her one more time. You made it to the end of this story, and that matters. It means you're someone who doesn't turn away from the hard truths about love and loss, someone who understands that the most powerful connections often exist in places we're told they shouldn't. You're part of a rare group, people willing to sit with discomfort, to feel deeply even when it hurts, to recognize that some stories don't have happy endings, but are still worth hearing because they contain truths we desperately need. If this story moved you, if it changed something in how you think about the bonds between humans and animals, or about the nature of memory and recognition and love itself, leave a comment saying, "This story changed the way I see the human-animal bond." By commenting, you become part of our community, people who seek out these rare, authentic moments that reveal depths most never witness. You'll be recognized among our most engaged followers, the ones who help us build understanding of these extraordinary relationships. Share this video with someone who needs to know that walking away doesn't always mean forgetting. That distance doesn't always diminish what two beings meant to each other. Share it with someone who questions whether animals truly remember us, whether the connections we form with them are real or just projections of our own need for meaning. Share it so that Aslan's story, and others like it, reach people who might otherwise never understand what's possible when we allow ourselves to be truly known by another creature. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that challenge everything you think you know about the relationships between humans and the wild world. We're building something here, a community of truth seekers who don't accept easy answers, who recognize that the most profound mysteries often hide in plain sight, waiting for people brave enough to acknowledge them. Click that subscribe button and join us in exploring the inexplicable, the extraordinary, the connections that defy scientific explanation but are no less real for their mystery. And when you're ready for more, when your curiosity demands another journey into the hidden corners of human-animal relationships, explore our other videos. We have stories of dolphins who returned to save the humans who rescued them, of elephants who traveled impossible distances to reunite with their caregivers, of wolves who remembered kindness across years of wilderness. Each one will challenge you. Each one will make you question the boundaries you've accepted. Each one will remind you that the world is stranger and more beautiful and more connected than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Diane left the reserve 3 days after Aslan's death, after his ashes had been scattered in the enclosure where he'd spent his final days. She'd stood there at sunrise, watching the wind carry pieces of him across the grass and into the air, and she'd made a promise. She would never again convince herself that distance was the same as strength, that walking away was the same as letting go, that protecting herself from pain was more important than honoring the bonds that gave her life meaning. She still works in wildlife rehabilitation. She still saves dying animals and releases recovered ones. But now, she allows herself to remember them, to carry them with her, to acknowledge that they changed her as much as she helped them. She keeps Aslan's photo on her wall, not hidden away as a painful reminder, but displayed openly as a testament to what's possible when two creatures decide to matter to each other despite every reason they shouldn't. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light hits just right, she can still feel the weight of his head in her lap, can still hear the rumble of his purr, can still see those amber eyes looking at her with recognition that transcended species and time and everything logic said should be impossible. Those moments don't hurt anymore. They're gifts, proof that what she and Aslan had was real, that the 7 years apart couldn't erase it, that some bonds, once formed, leave marks on the soul that nothing can remove. This is what no one tells you about loving something wild. You don't tame it, and it doesn't tame you. Instead, you meet in a space between domesticity and wilderness, between control and freedom, and you change each other in ways that can't be undone. Aslan didn't become human, and Diane didn't become lion, but they became something together. Two beings who recognized in each other something essential, something worth fighting for, something that 7 years and death itself couldn't diminish. That recognition, that seeing and being seen, is what we're all searching for, whether we know it or not. It's why stories like this one resonate so deeply, why they spread across cultures and continents, why they make grown adults weep and reconsider everything they thought they understood about connection. Because they prove that we're not as alone as we sometimes feel, that understanding can exist across seemingly unbridgeable divides, that memory and love can be more powerful than time or distance or even our own doubts about whether we deserve to be remembered at all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing Aslan's story, for honoring the bond he shared with Diane, for allowing yourself to feel the full weight of what their reunion meant. You're the reason stories like this survive, the reason these rare moments of truth get preserved and shared and passed along to people who need them. You're part of something important, a community that values depth over distraction, connection over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. Keep seeking these stories. Keep asking these questions. Keep allowing yourself to be moved by what you discover. Because in a world that often feels fragmented and disconnected, these moments of profound recognition, between humans and animals, between strangers, between our present and past selves, are what remind us of what's possible when we choose vulnerability over safety, when we choose to love despite knowing we'll lose, when we choose to believe that connection matters more than protection. Aslan waited 3 months at that fence. Diane waited 7 years to understand what she'd left behind. But in the end, they found each other. And that reunion, however brief, redeemed all the time they'd spent apart. That's the hidden truth this story contains. It's never too late to return to what mattered, to honor what was real, to prove that some bonds are stronger than fear or time or the lies we tell ourselves about having moved on. Now go. Share this story. Subscribe to the channel. Watch the others waiting for you. And most importantly, look at your own life and ask, what have I walked away from that might still be waiting? What connection have I convinced myself was one-sided or forgotten or too painful to revisit? What would I find if I had the courage to go back to that fence and see what's still there, still waiting, still remembering? The answer might change everything.